As a child, I always feared the night. As an adult, the fear hadn't left me, it just had a new name and face. It was my profession now. Working as a nocturnal taxi driver in the heart of Singapore, the quiet darkness that used to terrify me had become a companion, and its eeriness had become my livelihood. There were whispers among the cabbies of the bizarre passengers who hailed rides under the cloaking darkness, their destinations none other than Lim Chu Kang Cemetery or Kranji. The tales varied, but the spine-chilling end was always the same. The enigmatic passenger would vanish upon reaching the graveyard, often leaving behind hell money or dried leaves as an unsettling form of payment. This haunted folklore had always made the rounds among us drivers, and it was hard to find one who didn't shudder at the thought. Yet, as fate would have it, the story took an even darker turn, like a pit opening up beneath an already precarious foothold. One moonless night, I picked up a peculiar-looking man from the heart of the city. He was a tall, slender figure, clothed in a worn-out, faded suit. His face, partly veiled by the dim overhead light of the cab, wore a ghostly pallor. With a voice that was little more than a whisper, he asked to be driven to Lim Chu Kang Cemetery. As we drove, an unsettling silence fell over us. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror, only to meet his steady gaze. He seemed lost, his eyes reflecting a labyrinth of sorrow. His whole aura filled the cab with a cold, spectral air, and I could feel my hair stand on end. Upon reaching the cemetery, I turned to him for the fare. Instead, he extended a hand filled with what looked like dried leaves. Disoriented and feeling a chill creep up my spine, I looked up to question him, only to find the back seat empty. There was no trace of the man. The following days turned into a terror-filled haze. I couldn't shrug off the feeling of being watched, of a lingering presence always behind me. The back seat of the cab felt haunted, and the fear seeped into my daily life. The encounter echoed in my mind, growing more terrifying with each retelling. Around the same time, I heard whispers of a bizarre venture in the same cemetery. People, desperate for a quick buck, were selling salt to the spirits. It sounded absurd, almost laughable, yet the detailed accounts suggested something more ominous. According to the rumors, the trade was not easy and required strict adherence to certain rules. A single misstep could lead to dire consequences. Driven by curiosity and a desperate need to understand what was happening to me, I decided to investigate this odd business. Perhaps it was a way to make sense of my own haunting experience. Armed with salt and the rumor's rules, I headed to Lim Chu Kang Cemetery one late night. The air was thick with an unearthly silence as I walked the gravel paths, guided by the faint moonlight. Suddenly, a rustling noise caught my attention. I turned around, only to find a figure draped in a faded suit standing a few feet away. The sight was chillingly familiar, and the recognition hit me like a cold wind. It was the same man from my cab. He stood silently, his sorrow-filled eyes now possessing a demanding intensity. I felt an invisible pull towards him. My hands shaking, I held out the salt I had brought, a supposed offering for the spirits. The man extended his hand and, instead of taking the salt, dropped a piece of hell money in my palm. As I looked at the paper note, a cold realization washed over me. He was a spirit, bound to the graveyard, and my encounter in the cab was an unnerving connection between the living and the dead. The realization that I was trading with a spirit was a mind-numbing shock, but it also felt oddly calming. The confusion and fear that had plagued me for weeks suddenly fell into place, as the puzzle pieces of this chilling mystery started to align. The encounters grew more frequent. I would return to the cemetery night after night, each time met with the spectral figure in the worn-out suit. The initial fear began to subside, replaced by an eerie fascination. I felt a sense of camaraderie with the figure, whose sorrow-laden eyes were filled with stories from another world, untold and forgotten. Meanwhile, I found myself becoming a spectral figure in my own life, my waking hours haunted by the graveyard encounters. The boundary between the living and the dead seemed blurred, my existence straddling an uncanny line in between. However, as the days passed, I started to grow uneasy. Rumors began circulating among the drivers about mishaps related to the cemetery. A cabbie, stricken by an inexplicable illness. Another, losing his sight overnight. The tales were as eerie as they were diverse, and they all traced back to those who had encounters similar to mine. Rattled, I recalled the warnings about the strict rules of the spectral trade. Had I unwittingly broken some unspoken rule? The idea of it gnawed at my mind, planting seeds of paranoia that sprouted into nightmarish thoughts. The visits to the cemetery became increasingly terrifying. The spectral man's appearance changed subtly. His eyes, once filled with sorrow, now burned with a disquieting anger. The air grew heavier with each visit, as if warning me of an impending storm. One night, as I stood facing him in our usual spot, he extended his hand. In his palm lay not the familiar hell money, but a crumpled photograph. I reached out to take it, my hand trembling. The photograph was old and faded, but the image was clear. It was a picture of a young man, remarkably similar to my spectral companion, alongside a woman and 2 children. They looked happy, their smiles reflecting a life full of promise. The chilling reality hit me like a thunderbolt. The man was not just a random spirit, he had a past, a family, a life before death. A life that was haunting him just as he was haunting me. The haunting image of the photograph scorched itself into my mind, its implication a stark reminder of the spectral man's past life. His presence seemed less spectral and more human, his sorrow now more tangible. Overwhelmed by this newfound understanding, I decided to dig deeper into his past, hoping to find some resolution for both of us. I began to sift through records and news archives, piecing together fragments of a forgotten life. Each piece revealed a slice of the man's history, a successful businessman who met an untimely end in an unfortunate accident, leaving behind a wife and 2 children. His ties to the mortal world, however, seemed to linger even in death, manifesting in his haunting encounters. The sorrow and regret in the spectral man's eyes made sense now. He wasn't haunting out of malevolence, but from a sense of unfulfilled duty and longing for his lost life. He was tied to the mortal realm by chains of remorse, echoing through our encounters. Compelled by this knowledge, I returned to the cemetery, the photograph clutched tightly in my hand. As I stood in our usual spot, the spectral man materialized in front of me. His burning gaze softened when he saw the photograph. The next few moments felt as if time had frozen. I extended my hand, offering him the picture. As his translucent fingers brushed against it, a whirlwind of emotions washed over me: sadness, longing, regret, and ultimately, acceptance. A strange calm descended upon us, the spectral man's eyes reflecting a sense of peace I hadn't seen before. He nodded, his figure starting to fade before my eyes. I felt a surge of relief mixed with an inexplicable sense of loss. As his figure completely vanished, he left behind a small pile of hell money and dried leaves, his final payment. The cemetery fell silent, the spectral presence that once haunted it no longer lingering. In the days that followed, my life slowly returned to normal. The back seat of my cab no longer felt haunted, the nights were no longer filled with dread. The spectral man's story had come to a close, and in doing so, he brought closure to my own fears. His haunting was not an act of terror but a cry for recognition, a desperate plea from a lost soul yearning for release. I continue to drive my cab through the nights, the stories of the spectral passengers a chilling memory. Each fare I pick up, each journey I make, I'm reminded of the spectral man. His story, as terrifying as it was fascinating, serves as a reminder of the world beyond our own, the forgotten stories that linger in the shadows.